All right, so I hope everyone's ready for psychedelics. And I've kind of I named it The Business of Psychedelics, which maybe is a little bit of a misleading title, as I won't be talking so much per se about the businesses and businesses, but really the landscape of psychedelics. And I want to make this interesting both for people who come into the space who aren't that familiar yet, who might have a design background, and Alex told me about half of you are coming from that world, but also still make it interesting and hopefully provide good information for those that are a bit more familiar with psychedelics already. So Alex already introduced me a bit. So here's a bit more background on me. Um, I'm a psychologist by study, studied that over about a decade ago, and I have a master's degree from the Erasmus University. And I'm a psychonaut by participation and been learning from, enjoying, exploring psychedelics for about a decade now. And as an entrepreneur, I started Blossom 4.5 years ago to solve a problem I faced myself. Because during my psychology studies, I never heard about psychedelics. But as I learned more about them, I realized how important this information was. So I wanted to make it easier for people to learn about psychedelics based on actual research. So with Blossom, I try to share that information with the world. Today, I'm involved in Blossom, sharing that information. I also work as a consultant at Delphi, helping psychedelic startups, clinics, and nonprofits navigate this exciting new world. And as Alex said, at Flow Coaching, where we try to stay grounded and help people experience psychedelics in a guided, facilitated session. And I'll talk a little bit more about this also at the end of the presentation. I want to be transparent about my work in the space. I've worked with a lot of different companies, both in a paid position and as a volunteer, really to bring this information out to the world. So for instance, with Lucid News writing about psychedelics, or with the Open Foundation that organizes ICSPR, a scientifically focused conference that's happening in June here in the Netherlands. But maybe even more than just who I've been collaborating with, is that I don't really have a stake or a agenda to promote here. I don't hold stocks in any of the psychedelic startups that are developing them within the medical context. Maybe also I want to provide a relatively, I would say, critical or balanced perspective on psychedelics. And you'll hear me say some things that maybe you don't often hear from everyone who's super enthusiastic about them and sees them as a next big thing, which they are, but with some constraints. So before we dive into the fascinating world of psychedelics, I want to share a brief historical anecdote, because on this exact day, but then back in 1976, something remarkable happened in the world of technology. And maybe we can even see psychedelics as a technology. Steve Wozniak, one of the two founders of Apple, created the Apple I computer. And this was a big deal. This was way before my time, but what it had, and what computers didn't have before, was a way to integrate both a video display and a keyboard on a single board that you see here. People still had to get the keyboard, get the screen for themselves. And it was a big step towards making personal computing available as we know today. And I'm sitting here at the computer, 3 screens, the thing does everything I need to do. But has, of course, changed a lot since the beginning. So Wozniak and his friend and psychonaut, Steve Jobs, they sold some of their own stuff to pay for the development of the Apple I. And they started a company to sell this computer, which would eventually lead to Apple becoming the biggest technology company in the world. And I think the story of the Apple I shows the power of innovation, hard work, and trying to make technology available to more people. And in a way, I think that's similar to what's happening now with psychedelic research and therapy, where we're seeing a lot of interest and innovation aimed at making these powerful tools more widely available and understood. So with that in mind, let's explore what's going on with psychedelics and how they could change mental health, personal growth, and even the way we think about design. So in this presentation, we'll take a deep dive into the fascinating world of psychedelics. And we'll cover about these 3 areas. Before we dive into them, I want to give you a quick glance at the current landscape of psychedelics and how they could change medicine and personal growth. Then dive into the research landscape, where I'm quite familiar with, and introduce who's doing that, what are the focus areas and the challenges, and how design plays a role in all of this. And then we'll discuss the different ways people can experience psychedelics. So I'll map out 3 different paths: the medical path, the underground or coaching path, and the religious path. And for the coaching path, I'll share some of my own experiences. And finally, we'll take a look at the future of psychedelics. Look at what will happen with legalization. Is this only the way forward, or are there maybe also steps that are going backwards? The potential impact on healthcare and society, and the importance of using these substances responsibly and also integrating these experiences. And throughout the presentation, I'll keep an eye out on design, because of course, that's what we're talking about here too, and how that interacts with psychedelics. So before diving into those 3 topics, here's a quick overview of the psychedelic ecosystem. This map tries to distill kind of all the knowledge I've built over the last 4.5 years. And hopefully, if I'm explaining it, will become obvious that this is a tree with at the bottom as the roots, the funding coming from government, coming from pharma startups, coming from the nonprofit sector, which is all enabling the research. And throughout the research process and the drug development process, psychedelics, starting from the compounds, the current ones, and also second generation ones, are being developed and looked at as a possible indication for medical treatments, of course, for use around it in a wider area. And that's being applied by people in the care delivery system. So by the therapists, by people at clinics. And they, of course, need to be trained. So that's there in the middle. And then if we branch out from, the branches, then we can see that also slightly outside of the more medicalized system, there's a faith-based system. And also information that's happening around it. For instance, this conference, which is a media event, but also slightly focused on, right, how can we make sure the community gets the information they need? It to be manufactured, so there's a small part for that. And on the left side, we see adjunct industries. And so adjunct industries could mean things like the legal area or technologies. And then below that, there's sort of the interaction between policy and advocacy and the governments. So they are interacting both together with each other. So today I'll kind of touch mostly on the areas here in red, and then more tangentially, or kind of what we're doing here on the yellow areas. So let's dive into the research landscape. So this is a map here that you see on the right of the psychedelic field of research. These are all the areas where there's a significant research group or part of a university that's working on psychedelics. And on the screen are also some of the names of the groups that are working in it, mostly academic research centers, but also at some nonprofits and of course some for-profits working together with research centers. But I don't want to just go and read off the whole list here. Maybe I think the thing I want to say here most is that this is such a sea change from about 20 years ago. So at the time when David Nutt and Robin Carrot-Harris was at Imperial College London, but also at Johns Hopkins, where Roland Griffiths and his colleagues were then researching psychedelics in 2006, 7, 8. They were the first people to really start doing this in a bigger and more systematic way. You had some research happening in the 90s, but if I would have to guess, it was tens of people researching psychedelics. And now, at this time, there are about 100 publications that I see every month, with about 20 being significant and being added to the database. So before, about 20 years ago, it was career suicide to start working in psychedelics. And I think over the years, it has been legitimized and also has gotten a place within the academic system where psychedelics can actually be researched in a systematic way, also to see how they can be used for mental health, but even beyond that. Actually, the first studies with Roland Griffiths in 2006 were looking at how psychedelics impacted relatively normal, healthy people. And there you saw that a lot of them had a very significant spiritual experience. We'll come back to that in a bit. So I just mentioned a few of those areas where psychedelics are being researched for. And then the screen gives an overview of just about all of them. Maybe there are even more that I might have missed. where psychedelics are being researched. Let me just make this totally full screen, right? Otherwise, you're just looking at my Chrome browser. So here on the screen, you see most of the medical areas where psychedelics are being researched for. And if you aren't in the space, you might have heard about depression, anxiety, PTSD. But if I want to highlight some of the other things here too, well, microdosing, of course, there's a lot of research on it, and there's still a lot of debate on how and if it works. And of course, Paul Austin will be able to talk more about this. But beyond things that focus on mental health, I think it's also really interesting to see that psychedelics are being explored for other things like addictions, where we see really promising results already, but also on pain. And pain, for instance, chronic cluster headaches is an area where the current treatments are really not working. So we see that the treatments that are there maybe help 20, 30%. And with psychedelics, there are signals that it might help 60, 70%. So beyond even mental health, there are also other areas where psychedelics might help. And I wanted to talk in this presentation, but I think I just don't have the time for it, about sort of the mechanisms, how psychedelics works. I'll briefly touch on it here. But yeah, I think we can say that they work at different levels. So if we look at mental health, there's a large psychological component, and I'll talk about how the therapeutic container will really help set the stage for it. But if we, for instance, look at areas like chronic pain, there we maybe can see that also on a more neurological level, things change by using psychedelics. So that also on that level, things are changing. And we could talk about the different processes, but I would just say in general, there are different levels of explanation, both acutely when the treatment is happening, but also how someone after that engages with their environment, also giving some of those positive feedback loops. So hopefully you can look at the slide also after the presentation, and see sort of the myriad areas where psychedelics are being researched for. And kind of switching from this slide, I want to look at it through another lens and look at like, what are the psychedelics themselves that are being researched? So for Blossom, I've been looking at what is the magnitude of effect? Can we see what impact are they having? But also how much evidence is there? So it's here at the level of evidence. There's a whole rating system I won't bore you with, but just I want to talk about MDMA and ibogaine specifically on this slide. So MDMA, the active component in ecstasy, is being researched for the treatment of PTSD. And this is the psychedelic that's furthest along in the process. The phase 3 trials have been finished. And now the FDA is reviewing all of that evidence, asking some questions to the sponsor of the research called MAPS or Lycos. They're not for their public benefit arm. And so now we hopefully will have a decision from the FDA by August or soon after that, and have this become a therapy that is available somewhere at the end of the year or at the start of next year. But even there's still some hurdles. But what we can see here is that for about 4 in 5 people, the treatment had a clinically significant effect. So within a therapeutic container of about 12 different therapy sessions and 3 MDMA sessions, we can see that people really do improve. And also that for about 2 in 3 people that went through this whole protocol in the phase 3 trials, we can see that on a measure of, a commonly used measure of PTSD, they were, I would just want to say cured, but they were at a level so low that they wouldn't qualify for PTSD diagnosis. So LSD, psilocybin, DMT, or other psychedelics are being researched, with psilocybin being the furthest along. But for instance, one psychedelic you might not even have heard of is called ibogaine. And so this then is a psychedelic that is currently being researched, and where we have seen at the start of this year some promising results. And why I wanted to touch on this psychedelic is that there you see a lot of promise for addiction. So through also the neurochemical effects, see that it's breaking the addiction cycle, so that people with sometimes only one treatment really can break free of that cycle and then really pick up their life again. But as you can see here, there's a relatively large effect, but the level of evidence is really low. So there's only small studies, most of these looking at what is happening in treatment centers, for instance, in Mexico. But now the Stanford University has really started looking at this. So there is also momentum there for ibogaine. The psychedelic field, how exciting it is, and hopefully you heard that a bit in my voice, like, there's so much happening. There's still some big challenges and limitations that we need to talk about. So the first thing that maybe everyone could have already guessed is issue of blinding. It's really tough to do a proper double-blind study with psychedelics because the effects are so obvious. It's pretty clear if you're giving the placebo or the real deal. And when they are measuring this in studies, and they don't often do this, you really see that people like know what they've gotten. There are some ways to really think about this. Like, can we give them a lower dose of the psychedelic, or can we give them another drug that hasn't been shown to have therapeutic effects, but does have acute effects? So there are some ways people are thinking about this, but it is really difficult. And there, of course, is a large placebo effect. So within academic or within research of medicines, you want to see, is it the medicine or is it the expectation that people have? And then if they know they've gotten a psychedelic, then we can we maybe see that a lot of it is because of the placebo effect. So this is really something, those two things that work together and which are still something that is challenging within the field. But I should note that it's the same relatively in a lot of broader areas. For instance, with SSRIs, you see that when people take antidepressants and know the side effects, they are more likely to have a positive effect from it. So although they maybe have discomfort in their body, have headaches, have other things, they know they've gotten the SSRI. So, and because the therapist has said they would get better in this, at least that's what I'm assuming here, they are feeling better. So even outside of psychedelics, this is an issue. I don't want to touch on all of them because of time, but for instance, the economics of it is a really large part, and we'll touch on this in a bit later too. But psychedelic therapy, at least as convinced as we're looking at it right now, is time intensive. So it requires a lot of preparation and integration. So the therapist time of the whole treatment is really condensed within maybe 2-3 months, but in the time there's a lot of hours that are being spent. So it's not as simple as popping a pill or therapy that happens maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks. In legislation, there still needs to be a lot to change, right? Like even for MDMA, we have to see the DEA and the FDA come together and change laws around the rescheduling of this, but then probably only for medical use from the Pacific, from Lycos, from MAPS. We need training. We need a lot of therapists. And I think that's a part that people are working on really hard right now. And maybe I'll just touch on the last two combined, like for funding and for stigma. There still is stigma around this. In terms of funding, there are few, maybe just a handful of institutional investors that have come into the space. And also the big pharma companies, I think only 2 of the big pharma companies have really significantly invested into psychedelic medicines. So here, even though you could see, or like if it's been tracked over the years, that about a few billion have been invested in the space, this is still relatively peanuts, or really relatively small to developing other medical interventions. So I think there's still a lot of stigma around this. Like, can this work? Will people accept this? But as I talked about within academia, I think that stigma is going away. So then finally, I want to touch on the role of design in psychedelic research and some of the challenges that need to be overcome. Because like between therapy and research, I think this is how we design these spaces, how we design the trials, but then also later apply the therapy. I think that's really important. Just think about it. The setting where you have your psychedelic experience can make a huge difference. If it's a sterile clinical room or a cozy, inviting space, the lighting, the colors, textures, all of these design elements can influence your mindset and your openness to the experience. And the same goes for preparation and integration work. Like, are these setting structures? What kind of materials and tools are provided? So good design can make the process feel more engaging, more meaningful, and more actionable. And even how the therapy is designed, what protocols are being used, how the therapist interfaces with the patient. I think those are all things where people with a design mindset can really help. By bringing a human-centered approach to psychedelic research, we can create experiences that are not only effective, but also empowering and transformative. So I want to quickly touch on the right side of the screen here, where I've given two examples of psychedelic therapy. And at the bottom, you can see some examples that I think are relatively good or positive, where there's space for someone to hold hands. Where you can see here from the Imperial College London, where there is space for two therapists to sit together and for them to help the patient. And on the right, you see sort of an inviting space, a cool place at the start for where people can sit when they go to field trip. And then at the top here, this is from a recent article from Ecstatic Integrations about Jules Evans. It's from a psychedelic clinical trial. And in my head, a clinical trial would be like you see at the center at the bottom, where it's the space, everyone has thought about everything. But now that I've seen it a bit more and more, a clinical trial isn't always perfect, but also the treatment, how something happens, isn't perfect. So here you see the space where a patient in a trial is laying, where there isn't even room for the couch to stand straight. Everything there is white. It's not inviting. There's no ambiance. And if you take a step outside of the space there, you can see that it's next to a ketamine clinic in a strip mall somewhere in the middle of America. So really this space isn't inviting, it isn't really helping. And also what's described in the article about Hughes Evans is also that the therapist, yeah, as you can even see physically, there wasn't the space to hold hands, to comfort, to support the patient. So I think design really has an important role to play here. So we talked about our research. So now let's talk about the pathways to psychedelic experiences and talk about three of the different pathways. And so of the three pathways, on the left, you see the medical pathway, the bottom, the religious pathway, and on the right, underground, where I'm going to just put coaching also on that for right now. And they all have their pros and cons, and I'll talk about them in a moment. But here I want to say that the medical in general has the potential to have the highest impact, really to help people who need a lot of support, people we can't help right now. And we need to do a lot of research still for that. But we're seeing the first inclinations of that becoming available. And I'll also talk a bit about how that's being done with, for instance, ketamine. The religious use, something that has been grounded in tradition and that has been going on for centuries. This is where there are robust systems, but also where the use and people that have access might also be relatively limited. And then the underground area, right? Where we see people using psychedelics therapeutically or within a coaching framework at this moment. So I think those are the different routes, all with their pros and their cons. So if we zoom in on the medical landscape, it's the most officially recognized and also most regulated route. So it's a complex, evolving landscape with different psychedelics at different stages. And this map here is from Psychedelic Alpha, where you see that a lot of psychedelics are in the discovery and preclinical. So you see it in the outer ring here stage. But then if we try and zoom in, or if we zoom in, that's here on the right, and like who's further along on the path, you see that Spravato by Janssen, which is a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson, and Lykos with MDMA, which I talked about, they are furthest along. But then next to that, there's only two other ketamine products, and sort of outside that, we can see this below my head in the presentation. I see here the Compass also that's really nearby. So Spravato is now the thing that's medically available that insurance wants to pay for directly. It's a ketamine that's being approved for treatment-resistant depression, also with suicidal ideation. And it's something that has a hefty price tag, but which also means that the Johnson & Johnson, had the money to make this available, to really put in the effort to do the trials. And they did this, I think, maybe even just 3 years. But outside of that, so that's not really pictured here, ketamine is also available at ketamine infusion or ketamine therapy clinics, of which are about 750 available in the US. And it's usually at a relatively cheaper price. But the therapeutic container that's around it is usually a hit or miss. So sometimes people can just come in for an infusion and that's it. And other times there's more of a therapeutic container around it. And within the medical route, I talked a lot about the research for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. So the results there are promising, and there's a good chance that we could get FDA approval. But there's still political and cultural hurdles to overcome. And if you look online at a place where people are really putting the money behind the betting markets, see, does it become available? I think they're now saying it's about 60% to happen this year. I think I and everyone within the psychedelic industry has in their head it's 100%. But still, there's a lot of political process that needs to happen, and even the FDA could come back with a lot of questions and maybe demand from MAPS, from Lycos to do more studies. But say it does get greenlit, then we're talking at a therapy that, as far as we can now estimate, would cost upwards of $30,000 because it involves a lot of therapist hours. And Lycos, they do need to recuperate their costs even to make this treatment available to others too later. And that's a hefty price. And one thing I think that people might be missing, or which hopefully can inform the people that are in the psychedelic space already a bit about, is that insurance coverage is probably years away. So especially government programs like Medicare and Medicaid, they will take quite some years to see a new treatment that is available that maybe people are paying for themselves or self-funded companies are paying for before that becomes available. So the process of this becoming a widely available therapy isn't next year, and probably isn't even the next 3 years after that. Maybe only after that we'll see coverage from other commercial and later governmental sources. So I don't want to be too much of a wet blanket, but there's still a lot of regulatory red tape that needs to be overcome. And the same goes for people outside of the US. So I'm here in the Netherlands, where a lot of psychedelic research is happening and people are advocating for this to happen. The government is talking about this. They have an MDMA committee, but even then, they would need to have research that's happened here in Europe. So then again, that will take extra time, and then there needs to be approval through the EMA, so the European FDA. And that's just going to take time. If you're in the UK, you might be in luck now that they're outside of the EU. They might approve things relatively quickly by just taking over what the FDA is saying. But then again, the reimbursement, that's another question. So for instance, for Spravato, the UK body there has said, we're not going to reimburse this, because also Johnson & Johnson was saying to them, we want to use this, that, and that. And they're saying, like, it doesn't show the efficacy we want to see for new treatment that is this pricey. So what does it all mean? The medical path is still the most legitimate and controlled to access to psychedelics, and has the potential to reach a lot of people, but slow, expensive, and sometimes a frustrating process with a lot of barriers and unanswered questions. And that's why many people are exploring other pathways like the underground and coaching route, or the religious use of psychedelics. So let me move to the underground and coaching side. And here on the slide, you kind of see all the way in the top left, the Imperial College Clinic, right? It's so small versus how people are using it in an underground way. But before I dive into that, I kind of want to put it into even more context, because I'm talking about the therapeutic, the coaching, the self-improvement way of using psychedelics. But most psychedelics are, of course, being used outside of that context, at festivals, together with friends at home, somewhere in nature. So actually, the use of psychedelics, where people generally also see, if you look at studies over time, see positive effects, is being used outside of everything I'm talking about today. I just wanted to add that little piece of context for that too. So then going back to the underground and the coaching path. So first talk a bit about the underground. I have to say 99% of the psychedelic use into a more a coaching therapeutic container happens here versus clinical trials. Clinical trials have thousands of people every year versus hundreds of thousands, I would estimate here. And many people find, I'm sorry, um, psychedelic underground use happens in a lot of different contexts. So it's both below and above the ground. And above the ground, we're talking about decriminalized cities in the States, in the US, where personalized possession of psychedelics is no longer being prosecuted, or in other places, other countries like Mexico, Brazil, Jamaica, and the Netherlands, where psychedelic retreats and ceremonies operate in sort of semi-legal, sometimes really legal area. But besides that, it's kind of happening all around the world. And so there is more structure than people just doing psychedelics on their own at a festival. But what I want to say, or what I want to highlight here, is that a lot of times the people that are helping others here lack training. I don't per se mean lack training in psychedelics. I think people are relatively well informed about psychedelics, but lack in training of being able to provide the other help that people need around it. So especially around recognizing where are the limits of the people that are working with psychedelics, so they can refer someone to other help. As a underground coach, you can't help people with their finances, their unsafe house, with a prescription. So those are all things that more fit within the medical system. So now it's still sometimes a coordination between those two areas. And still, it has some great benefits. I mean, if you look at this versus medical, the cost can be 1/10, 1/30th of what medical treatments would be. So making it more accessible to others. And could be a place where people would feel more comfortable doing this with a coach or someone in the underground versus a doctor with more status and with more distance from someone. So there's some pros and cons here to this for the underground and for the coaching. So I'm gonna go a bit over time. I'm already seeing, but hopefully you'll stick with me for a bit and have a shorter break. Because I want to talk a bit about my own experience as working as a psychedelic facilitator here in the Netherlands. And on the screen, you see sort of our space that we built specifically for this. And by my fiance there, they're sitting as our person for the photos. So in the Netherlands, there's a unique legal landscape when it comes to psychedelics. So magic mushrooms are illegal, but psilocybin containing truffles served at their fruiting bodies, they are legal and unregulated. So there's nothing about them in the law. So it's not decriminalized, but fully legal. So you can buy them in smart shops without a special permission or any oversight. Of course, you have to be 18, but next to that, nothing. But it doesn't mean that people can start offering psychedelic assisted therapy. The truffles may be illegal, but facilitating or guiding someone's experience for therapeutic uses is still a gray area legally and ethically. I would say an area you don't want to be in, but you can see that a lot of people are operating there. And that's why where I and my fiance, we also drawn the line. We want to do coaching with psychedelics, meaning we're not claiming to offer medical treatments or psychotherapy, but rather a space for personal growth, meaning making and expanding someone's horizon. Because I have a background in psychology, but I know that I'm limited as a coach. I can treat severe mental health conditions like a chronic depression that requires a higher level of medical care with access to medication, housing support, and crisis intervention. And so that's even because despite the challenges I've identified for the medical path, I'm still a big believer in the potential of that for psychedelic therapy. And at the same time, for people who are generally relatively well, I've seen a lot of incredible transformation with the people I've worked with as a coach. And we really try to have a strong container. I think that's maybe the final thing to highlight here is that we do more hours of coaching than the actual psilocybin session is taking, right? So that's what I want to say, that I think even within a coaching framework, I think that's really important, and not just blast someone with a psychedelic. And finally, also an area where I personally don't have a lot of experience is the religious path. So this is where psychedelics have been used for centuries. From the mystery cults of ancient Greece to shamanic traditions of Siberia and the Amazon, psychedelics has long been revered as sacred medicines and tools for connecting with the divine. And even some scholars, some that you might have heard of, say that psychedelics played a key role in the development of human spirituality, even evolution, and religion itself. And I just want to highlight here that I think one of the key roles of the religious path is that there's such a good container around it. It's something that's been battle tested for thousands of years. So there you really get a lot of support around it and a lot of ideas, a lot of elders that have done this for many, many years. At the same time, we now see a lot of tourism to places where there's that religious use and you see it, you kind of lose the spirit that it had. But also, if you look at that legal side, which I touched upon earlier, only 2 churches in America have a exemption from the government to import and to use psychedelics. And so all the other churches that you might have seen pop up, and those are also maybe in the hundreds, those are actually not working fully legally. But some people are again challenging this, saying, can we make that happen through the religious path too? So we explore the different paths that psychedelics can become available through. And then I want to look in this final section at some future developments. I want to look at 3 key areas that will shape the future of psychedelics around the legalization efforts, around the potential impact on the healthcare system and society as a whole, and then finally, again, on the intersection between design and psychedelics. Because with the legalization of psychedelics, we've seen a lot of awesome efforts happening in the last 5 to 10 years. And we've seen a lot of positive progress with decriminalization and even therapeutic frameworks becoming available as the first place in 2020 in Oregon. But it's not only something that's going up to the right, everything's becoming better. I think now we're starting to see also in the media landscape a bit of a backlash against psychedelics. There was a lot of positive signals, but now also some more negative signals are getting out, which has led to, in Oregon, you see here the headline from ABC, to the decriminalization. Even when I was typing it, my computer said, is it not, not recriminalization. My computer was saying decriminalization. I'm saying the two, it's so programmed. The recriminalization of drugs, including psychedelics. So the therapeutic framework, the Therapy Services Act there is still available. But you see there that there's a bit of backlash and there's a law that's now being turned back. And even within the people that offer psilocybin services in Oregon, there are now signals that there's more people that have this as a service than there's demand for it. So I think also there we have to sometimes step outside of our bubble and see, is there a need for this, or how is it being offered, and can we offer it in that way? And then if we look at healthcare and society, so all the other images you've seen were real images, but this is a generated image of a psychedelic, enthusiastic, psychedelic friendly US president. So just imagined her in this way, giving a speech, having a bit more of a psychedelic jacket on. So there's a big impact that they can have on the healthcare system and society as a whole. From a medical perspective, the integration of psychedelic-assisted therapies into mental health care could represent a major paradigm shift, because it could be hope for patients that currently haven't found anything through the conventional treatments. And as I said, with the MDMA studies for PTSD, something I didn't touch upon is that on average, the people that were in the trial were walking around with chronic PTSD for about 15 years. So that's just such a change after walking around with it for 15 years to kind of not have a diagnosis anymore. So I think we really have to rethink about how medical systems work, and what we can do are the new possibilities. So I think there's a lot of hope here. But also, how can we reframe it? How can we refactor it so that there's a lot of upfront cost, right, in the short term of the therapy, but then it has a lot of benefit at the end. So there we can also come back to what is insurance willing to pay for. And even there, they're thinking usually on a 1 to 3 year timeline. So can they think beyond that? And if you look at society, maybe something that might surprise you, that psychedelics are being used more now than they were being used in the 60s. But I think now there's less of that connection with counterculture, less of it not meshing with mainstream culture, but also that there's a lot more information out there, like conferences like this, that talk about the risk, about how people can use them. There's more responsible use, especially if you look back at the academic studies at the time from the 60s, then you'd be surprised how everything went then. So there's growing acceptance of psychedelics and I think a cultural shift. But still, we have to be careful and have to be balanced, and really face the risk and mitigate them when they come up. And we don't want psychedelics to kind of like just fit in with healthcare and just fit in with psychedelics, right? With society. We want it to change society, to change healthcare. And finally, here's an image I took from Psychedelics Design from Alex, really showing like how psychedelics and design are really meshing together. Because I think that design doesn't just talk about the aesthetics as we're kind of seeing here, which color is being used, but just as with the design of the Apple One computer, it can help catalyze how we're using psychedelics, how they become available, how they are perceived, and how they are integrated into society. So from the design of clinical trials, from the treatment protocols, what tools we can have around them, what platforms there are, what support there is. I think designers have the opportunity to optimize the therapeutic potential of psychedelics while minimizing the risk and barrier to access. And I think there we, from the psychedelic world, can still learn so much from people in the design world to really see how we can integrate psychedelics with the rest of society. So I'm seeing already a bit more over time. So I think I'm just gonna leave that there. I want to thank you all so much for listening to or being here with me at this presentation. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can see my email in the top right. So feel free to send a message if you have any questions, ideas, feedback. And if you want to learn more about psychedelic research, then go to blossomanalysis.com, where about 80-90% of the information, the core information, is available for free. If you click around, you do have to make an account, but that's it. If you want to learn more about psychedelics and coaching, if you're around this area or willing to travel, just take a look at flowcoaching.nl /en, or you'll see the flag to go to the English version, and see if that might be something for you. And we also have some information on the site about psychedelics and coaching. And then maybe if you're thinking like, how do we get into this space? What do we want to do here? Please feel free to also check out Delphi Circle, where I talk more about what we're doing in terms of consultancy.